Hi everyone. So if you're watching this video, it's because you missed last week's class when we did the rhetorical verbs lesson in person. So while this is sort of a really big in-person discussion activity-based lesson, I'm going to try to do my best to make it something you guys can do individually on your own. So we're going to start off here. I'm going to share my screen. There will be several points in this video where I ask you to pause and do something the way we would do it during class. So just be ready for that. We're going to start off. To access the lesson, you can go to your course page and you can click on this rhetorical verbs lesson exit ticket assignment. If you go to that, you'll see it says up here, for those of you who were not in English class last week, watch this video of the lesson. This will be linked momentarily, and it's going to walk you through. This is the document that we used. You can also find it on the landing slide, the landing page slide. You'll see some of your classmates already submitted this. These are folks who did, in fact, attend last week's lesson either in class on Friday or via Zoom, that they zoomed into one of the other sections. So you're going to be submitting to the same place they did, but you'll just start by opening this document. It's going to force you to make a copy. And then you're going to see the whole lesson. Now, this lesson is 4 slides long. And you'll see that it actually has space here in it for you to type, including your final exit ticket down here. So that's why this is the actual doc that you're going to submit to the assignment. We're going to work through the first 3 pages of it together in class now via video, and then you'll do the last one for homework and submit it to the assignment. So we're going to start off here on slide 1. And this is what we're starting off with. I'm going to give you a scenario, and we're going to act as though we are going to be making this argument. So in our scenario here, you're going to write an essay trying to convince people that the weather, let's say rain, this particular weather event has an effect on human behavior. That's your purpose, that's your goal, that's your thesis. The weather affects human behavior. You as a speaker, your persona here, you have personally experienced this weather. But you're not a weather expert, you're not a scientist, you're just a person who has made this observation and you're trying to convince other people of it. Your audience, on the other hand, they have not personally experienced this weather phenomenon you're talking about, the rain. They don't even know what rain is, so how are they going to understand how it affects human behavior? So they're going to be skeptical of your claim. So now here's my question. What are some choices, given this scenario, that you would make in crafting your text? What would you need to do to persuade your audience? So, for example, what would you address first? What kinds of evidence do you use? That kind of thing. What do you do in this scenario? How do you convince this audience of skeptics who's never even experienced rain that rain has an effect on human behavior? Take a second, about 2 minutes, pause the video, and brainstorm right here in this document some things that you might do to persuade your audience. Okay, so I've just taken some time to include some ideas that classmates typically share out for this activity. So people might say, we have to give examples of the rain influencing behavior. That's a good idea. We might have to explain what rain is, since they've never experienced it. They need that foundation. I might tell a story about what the rain has done to my mood. I might use scientific evidence or data to back me up. I might start with an example to get their attention. And these are all okay ideas. They're a great starting place for recognizing the kinds of choices we would make in crafting our text. But the goal of this lesson is to take our foundation and sort of our initial conception of what authors do and broaden our ability to talk about it. Rhetorical analysis is all about talking about what authors do. And so that leads us to our second slide, which is that rhetorical analysis is all about explaining what authors are doing in their text. And when we're talking about what is being done, we need good, strong verbs. Things are not done using nouns, right? So if I go back to this slide and I said we use evidence, well, great, but evidence is a noun. It's not a verb. Use is a verb, sure, but it's not a very specific one. Tell a story, explain, give. Those verbs are all really weak. And so we can make our rhetorical analysis better by understanding and being able to express what the authors are doing by paying attention to the verbs. So I find that this is true in students' typical attempts to write analysis. Our ideas are on track, but our verbs could be better. And focusing on verbs can actually help us even notice things that we didn't notice before. So, for example, I will tell you, when I was reading your Thank You for Arguing quiz essays about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, I noticed this immediately. And you guys would say something like, Chamberlain uses ethos. And I would do this like total cringe. Now, of course, I didn't hold it against you because I hadn't taught you this yet. But it's students' kind of natural proclivity to say, oh, the author uses metaphors. How do we take that idea and explain what he's actually doing with those metaphors? That's what rhetorical analysis is all about. And so today's activity, if we were doing this in class in a non-COVID year, we would actually get out little slips of paper and we would physically move them around on the desks. And students tend to actually enjoy that, but we have to do it electronically this year. But the point of it is to familiarize you with some good verbs that describe writing, and just to kind of get you thinking about the meanings of different verbs, distinguishing between the subtleties of them. This whole activity is really just about getting you thinking more in depth about these words that are used to describe writing. So you will want to pick one of these verb sets. They're all the same, they're just different colors. So I'd like you to pick one and open it up. It's going to ask you to make a copy once again. And when you make your copy, this is what it's going to look like. And you'll see it's just a giant list of little boxes with verbs in them. And what you are going to do is sort these verbs into different categories. So here's the rules as we go through this. You're going to sift through the verbs to try to group them into categories, whatever categories make sense to you. You can group them into whatever categories you see, but they have to be categorized by verb meaning, not some surface level quality. Like you can't say like, oh, all of these verbs start with A, so I've grouped them together. That doesn't work. You have to actually be thinking about the meaning of the verbs. Categories can have as many or as few verbs as you want, and you can have as many categories as you want. They don't have to be even. So you might have a category with 3 verbs, you might have a category with 6 verbs. Doesn't matter. If you run into a verb whose meaning you're not sure of, make a note of it, look it up, because you can't categorize it unless you know what it means. So if there's a verb you're not sure of, don't try to force fit it into a category. Finally, not all words have to fit into categories. If you end up with a leftover pile, a slush pile, that's okay too. And when we're done with the verb sort, what we're going to do, I want everybody to kind of attempt this on their own, just so they get the thinking sort of practice here. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at how different groups completed this task, and we're going to talk about how they group them together. Okay, so this is a verb sort that was done by one of the groups in class. And what we see here, try to move myself out of the way, is this is how they group them. Now you can see that this group actually removed a lot of the verbs, which is fine. But what I'd like you guys to do is take just a minute to look at their categories and see how you think they grouped them. Why did they put this group together? Why did they put this group together? Why did they put this group together? What do you notice? Can you figure out, without them telling you, why these verbs fit together? You might have noticed that this little category here in white, questions, ponders, speculates, those are all verbs that have to do with not being sure of something. An author might do those things if he is making some guesses. You might notice that these over here alludes, hints, assumes, interprets, suggests, implies, predicts. These are all verbs that get at the author not coming right out and saying for sure, but relying on the audience to make the connections. We might take a look at this green category over here. Overstates, substantiates, reinforces, asserts, evokes, bolsters, empathizes, intensifies, highlights, unpacks. When I look at this category, I see some of these verbs make a lot of sense together. To overstate, substantiate, to reinforce, to bolster, to intensify, to highlight. Those verbs all have to do with drawing attention to something. But what I see in here is some of them don't quite fit, like evoking and empathizing. And so they don't quite fit, but that's okay, because the point of this lesson is to have this conversation. I will tell you, bolsters is one of those verbs that students often don't know. It means to support. You could bolster your argument with substantiating evidence. It simply means to support. It's certainly way better than give or present. Right? Let's look at another verb sort that a different group created. Same thing. Take a minute to look at their categories and see if we can recognize why they grouped them the way they did. In this case, I noticed that they included this very small category, lists and chronicles. And I think those two verbs fit perfectly together, and they're great that they're in their own little category. Chronicles is another verb. I think this is a discussion we usually have, is that the difference between what does it mean to list something, what does it mean to chronicle something. The word chronicle has this root to it, chron, which means time. And so if I list things, it doesn't matter what order they're in, right? But if I chronicle something, I'm telling something in a timeline fashion that becomes more important. What a precise, vivid verb to explain what the author is doing, if they're in fact doing that, telling something in an order that requires time. Over here in this red category, they used verbs like provokes, attacks, manipulates, rejects, ridicules, argues, satirizes. These are all verbs that we would use to describe when an author is in opposition to something, when they are in disagreement with something. We would say that they attack the idea or they ridicule the idea. Let's look at one more verb sort. We would have looked at 3 of them if we had done this in class. And these guys made a whole bunch of categories, but they are, in fact, smaller. We can see they've got some similar categories to the other few groups. We've got, I like this purple category, reasons, observes, establishes, incorporates, and connects. These are sort of your basic verbs to describe what if the author is using reasoning or evidence in a very non-judgmental kind of way. They're not in favor of it, they're not against it, they're just putting it out there. Whereas focuses, bolsters, overstates, intensifies, and highlights. It's kind of what they would do after this, right? You would incorporate evidence and then focus in on the impacts of it. These guys created a much smaller list of sort of more negative. Actually, now that I look at this, I want to take that back. I'm not sure what they're doing here. Provokes, motivates. Those two seem to go together, but extends and justifies. Those two, to me, feel like they fit better down here. I wonder what you guys think about that. Over here, we've definitely got our more negative ones. Attacks, opposes, excludes, argues, questions, distinguishes, rejects, ridicules, contradicts. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how we would talk about these verb sorts in class, right? Just to get an idea of what these verbs mean and how or when we might use them to describe what an author is doing. The entire point of that lesson, of that activity, is to have that conversation, to just talk a little bit about what the verbs mean. Now we're going to take that and apply it in a useful sort of context. So first of all, this is sort of the crux of it all. I've given you here a link to a rhetorical verbs list. It's a Google Doc. I will eventually get you a copy of it in person. But the crux of the matter is that starting now, these words are banned from our vocabulary in AP essays. Uses, utilizes, employs, says, and talks about. These are weak verbs that are going to lead you to very simplistic rhetorical analysis. My goal is to get you thinking about what the author is doing, not what the author is using. And use, utilizes, employs, they're the same thing. Says, talks about, real general. All right, so these words cut from our vocabulary. As I mentioned before, these are the words that students naturally gravitate toward when they try to analyze. But all of these verbs lead us to nouns. The nouns don't capture what the author is doing. So when banning these words, I'm trying to push you into stronger rhetorical analysis by forcing you into specificity. This has worked really well for me in the past. This rhetorical verbs list is going to help you. It's going to be a reference for alternatives while you're writing. So here is a copy of the list, and you'll see that this is basically just a list of those verbs we did in the sort. When you do timed writes in the class, obviously I can't speak for on the AP exam, but when you do timed writes for class, you're actually going to use this list as a reference. I want you to internalize these. I want you to get used to thinking about writing in these terms so that when you do need them for the exam, you have them. All right. And so one last thing about the importance of verbs. This is a metaphor that I didn't come up with, but I really like. If I ask you how you built a house, you wouldn't say, oh, well, I used a hammer and nails. I mean, maybe you did, but that's not helpful at telling me anything about how you did it. If you were going to tell me how you built the house, you would need to use verbs that tell me what you did. So you might say you drafted the floor plan, you measured the wood, you sawed the lumber, you hoisted the walls into place. Look at how much better these verbs are. Measured, sawed, hoisted, drafted. They're so much more specific than using hammer and nails. Uses, right? So kind of keep that in the back of your mind, is why I'm pushing this rhetorical verbs thing so hard. Which leads us to kind of our follow-up. So now that we've got good verbs floating around in our consciousness, they're real fresh in our memory, using this list that we got, let's revise our original list of what an author might do in the given scenario on slide 1. So remember, we came up with things like give examples, explain what the rain is, tell a story, use scientific evidence, start with an example. Those are all okay moves, but they're really weak. So now we're going to try to revise them. And we might even come up with totally new moves, since we now have this rhetorical vocabulary to help give us ideas about moves the writers might make. And so what I'd like you guys to do is stop the video, pause it, and take about 3 minutes using this verbs list to come up with some better descriptions of what the author might do using good verbs. Okay, so here's my revised list. I might choose to narrate my personal experience with the rain. I might bolster my own anecdotes with scientific evidence. I might personify the rain as a villainous character. That's something that I didn't even think about when I did my initial brainstorm, but when I was looking at my verbs list and I saw the verb personify, I said, oh yeah, I could do that. I might extend my argument to other forms of weather and mood connections, maybe things that my audience are familiar with. I might allude to those experiences in order to make my audience come to the conclusions themselves. These are all descriptions of what the author is doing using really strong, vivid verbs. And so when we do rhetorical analysis, when we look at what the author's doing, this is the way we want to be able to explain it. I had you go about this kind of the opposite way of putting you in the place of the writer, which is always kind of a good place to start when we're talking about what authors do. But here's our follow-up activity. And this is the exit ticket that you're going to turn in, but you're actually going to turn in this whole doc. So I'll be able to see your initial brainstorm. I don't need to see your verb sort. I'll be able to see your revision, and I'll be able to see then your final thing. Here's your assignment. I'm asking you to read and annotate this essay. It's called Santa Anna by Joan Didion. Santa Anna is a really cool essay. It's short, it's like 7 paragraphs long, really vivid description. But what Didion is doing in this essay is she is making kind of that very argument that we just brainstormed. She's trying to convince her audience that the weather, specifically the Santa Ana wind, which is a phenomenon experienced in Southern California, she's trying to convince the audience that this wind affects human behavior. She calls it mechanistic. And so her whole argument is doing the very scenario that we just brainstormed. So when you're done reading and annotating it, I want you to answer this question. What did Didion do to convince her audience of skeptics that the weather influences human behavior? What moves did we see Joan Didion making in this essay? I want you to analyze her choices that she made in crafting the text using the rhetorical verbs list that we just got at the end of class. Use it as a reference. Have it in front of you or next to you. Don't tell me what she said or what she used, but tell me what she did. All right, using those rhetorical verbs here is the point of this assignment. I want you to underline any rhetorical verbs you're using to describe her choices. And I'm only looking for a short paragraph here, okay? Not anything gigantic essay, just a short paragraph describing what Joan Didion did as she crafted this essay. How did she convince her audience? I want you to end your paragraph but with just a statement on this. Did she do the things that we predicted in the scenario brainstorm? Did she use examples or anecdotes or scientific evidence or any of those things actually what we saw her doing in the piece? Or upon reading, did you notice maybe some moves she made that you didn't even anticipate? Just to kind of wrap up and connect with kind of what we did today in our brainstorm. You're going to type your paragraph again right in this doc and then submit this entire doc to the Schoology assignment back here.